Hey guys, welcome to another episode full of history facts you absolutely don't need, but good luck for getting them. So, you've got a headache, maybe a fever, maybe a weird rash you don't want to talk about. Congratulations, it's the year 1347, and your best option is a man with no germ theory, no medical degree, and a rusty blade he keeps in the same pouch as his lunch. Welcome to the magical world of medieval medicine, where being a doctor often meant doing slightly less damage than whatever was already killing you. I'm glad you stumbled into this charming nightmare, but before we crack open a vein for old time's sake, why not drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from? Whether you're trying to fall asleep, stuck on a night shift, or just wondering how bad things could really get, it's genuinely fascinating to know. Also, fair warning, it's about to get messy, historically messy. Let's begin with a foundational idea so wrong it managed to mess things up for over 1,000 years. The theory of the four humours. Picture the human body as a sort of gross soup. According to ancient Greek physicians, and later their medieval fanboys, your health depended on the balance of four vital fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you're wondering what black bile is, the answer is nobody actually knows. But that didn't stop medieval doctors from confidently diagnosing you with too much of it. Feeling depressed? That's black bile. Angry for no reason? Yellow bile. Got a runny nose? Too much phlegm. Bleeding from the eyes? Guess what? Still a humour problem. Every emotion, illness, and unexplained twitch had a liquid scapegoat. Now, here's where it gets charming. If your humours were unbalanced, the obvious solution was to remove some of them. Enter bloodletting, a practice so common that it became the Swiss Army knife of medieval medicine. Headache, bleed, fever, bleed. Stubbed your toe in the dark and now you think it's possessed. Bleed. And bleed you would, thanks to an impressive range of tools that scream, "Don't trust me." The basic kit included lancets, which are basically razors pretending to be precise, and fleams, which sound like a Victorian insult, but are actually multi-bladed instruments designed to open veins like you're tapping a keg. If that sounds painful, don't worry. They also had leeches. Nothing says cutting-edge medical care like slapping a living parasite on your face and hoping it gets bored before you die of anemia. Some physicians preferred cupping, which involves heating glass cups and sticking them onto your skin to create suction. This draws the blood to the surface, which they then slice open for good measure. It's sort of like a spa day, if your spa was run by vampires with a grudge. They even had charts telling them which vein to open depending on your illness. Pain in your liver? That's a job for the basilic vein. Got the plague? That'll be the median cubital. And yes, I know what you're thinking. Surely someone noticed that bleeding people out made them worse. But no, because if you died, it just meant the disease was too strong. If you survived, well, clearly the treatment worked. You can't lose if you never check your data. This wasn't fringe stuff either. Bloodletting was the treatment. Kings, peasants, monks all got drained like expired Capri Suns. Even the big brains of the time were into it. Galen, the ancient Roman physician whose writings basically became medieval med school, was a huge fan of the four humours. And everyone else just kind of copied his homework for the next 1,300 years. To be fair, they didn't exactly have a lot to work with. Microscopes hadn't been invented yet. Bacteria, viruses, completely unknown. So, when someone got sick, it wasn't your immune system is compromised. It was, your blood is probably too spicy. The logic was basically, if you're full of bad fluids, just get rid of some. It's like fixing a car by draining all the oil and hoping it runs better with less. Of course, there were risks, mostly that you die. But the really fun part is that bloodletting was often done repeatedly. You weren't just bled once and sent on your way. No, you'd come back in a few days for more, paler and more confused each time, like a ghost slowly paying off a medieval gym membership. And lest you think we're safely past this phase, let me ruin your confidence in modern humanity for a moment. Bloodletting never completely disappeared. In fact, it was still going strong into the 19th century. George Washington, first US president, literally bled to death after doctors removed 5 pints of blood to treat a throat infection. 5 pints. That's like 40% of what he had. And in a moment of supreme irony, modern medicine does still use bloodletting in extremely specific cases, like hemochromatosis, where your body stores too much iron. But those procedures are based on science, not bad vibes and bile charts. Even today you'll find health influencers and wellness blogs cheerfully suggesting blood detoxes, leech therapy, or cupping for energy flow. So really, medieval medicine isn't dead. It just rebranded and got itself a website. In summary, if you were alive in the Middle Ages and fell ill, your odds of survival depended largely on how fast your doctor could drain you without emptying you completely. And somehow, they thought this made perfect sense. It wasn't a scam, it was science, just very early science, proto-science, science with a head injury. And while it's easy to laugh at their misguided efforts, it's also kind of haunting. These people were genuinely trying to help. They saw suffering and thought, maybe if we just remove some of what's inside you, the rest will feel better. Which, coincidentally, is also the logic behind exorcisms and serial killers. Anyway, that's just one slice of the medieval medical nightmare buffet, because bleeding you out was only the first thing they did. Now, what if instead of draining your blood, they gave you something to swallow? Something earthy, maybe crunchy, definitely unregulated. Ah yes, so you've survived medieval bloodletting. Congrats on not being drained like a wineskin at a monk's birthday party. But don't worry, if the leeches didn't do the trick, there was always the second course in the great medieval menu of questionable medicine. Potions. And by potions, I mean an astonishing blend of desperation, bad science, and vibes. We're talking medieval medicine's version of a cocktail, except instead of getting tipsy, you might get dysentery. Or, if you were lucky, just violently nauseous. You see, medieval Europe didn't just run on superstition and religious guilt. It also ran on a thriving apothecary industry. Apothecaries were kind of like pharmacists, if pharmacists also believed unicorn horns could cure epilepsy and didn't have to list side effects. These folks mixed up all kinds of herbal, mineral, and downright mythical ingredients into potions, powders, pastes, and pills. And they did it with the swagger of someone who had absolutely no idea what they were doing, but a very impressive mortar and pestle. Let's start with the classics. One of the all-time favourite ingredients, crushed mummy. Real, dried up, imported Egyptian mummies ground into a fine powder and sprinkled over your wound or stirred into wine like morbid Nesquik. They called it mumia, and it was supposed to heal everything from headaches to internal bleeding, because nothing says healing like consuming a centuries-old corpse. And yes, this was a thing for hundreds of years. Rich people loved it. Nothing impresses your medieval dinner guests like a bottle of red with notes of Merlot and Pharaoh. Then there was powdered skull. Human skulls, dried and pulverized, were considered particularly effective against migraines, because clearly the best way to treat a head that hurts is to add more skull to it. Honestly, you've got to admire the logic. If your head's broken, just put more head in there. And if mummies and skulls weren't quite magical enough, you could always try unicorn horn. Spoiler alert, unicorns were just narwhals, but people didn't know that. Wealthy collectors and snake oil salesmen alike would pass around spiral tusks like enchanted baguettes, swearing they could neutralize poison, cure the plague, and probably realign your chakras while they were at it. These things were so expensive, they made diamonds look like gravel. Of course, not all medieval remedies came from the graveyard or fantasy novels. Plenty of them came from your local garden, and I say that with caution. Because while modern herbalism has some legitimate roots, medieval herbology was more like chaotic guesswork with a side of superstition. For example, take mandrake root, which looks vaguely like a human baby if you squint and have a vivid imagination. People believed pulling one out of the ground would kill you unless you used a dog to do it. Yes, you had to tie it to a dog, run away, and let the dog yank it free, presumably while the plant screamed and your neighbours silently decided never to visit you again. And then we get to things like arsenic, which, surprise, is poisonous. But that didn't stop people from prescribing it in small doses for everything from ulcers to syphilis. Because if a little bit kills rats, surely a little less will heal you. This is why testing wasn't a thing back then, unless you count seeing if the patient dies. Now, none of this would have been possible without the local apothecary, who was part pharmacist, part witch, and part chaotic neutral energy. They kept jars and jars of dried plants, ground bones, mystery powders and decoctions, which is just a fancy way of saying whatever we boiled and didn't throw away. If a doctor was the guy with the expensive robes and zero clue, the apothecary was the one with the cluttered shop and the vague smell of mouldy rosemary and regret. And the smells. Oh, the smells. Most of these potions didn't taste like candy. They were designed to taste awful, because back then, the worse something tasted, the more powerful it was assumed to be. A good cure had to burn, gag, or make you question your will to live. That was just part of the charm. You didn't just get better, you suffered your way to wellness. But here's the best part. Some of it kind of worked. Accidentally, like stumbled into mild effectiveness levels of working. Willow bark, for instance, actually contains salicin, which is chemically similar to aspirin. And poppy-based concoctions had pain-killing properties. So between all the mummified nonsense and skull sprinkles, there were a few ingredients doing the heavy lifting, like that one co-worker in a group project. That said, most of what people swallowed back then was either inert, mildly toxic, or straight-up horrific. But people kept taking it. Why? Well, the placebo effect is a powerful thing. If you believe powdered rhino horn or unicorn horn or dragon's blood, which was actually red tree resin, is going to cure you, then your brain might just play along. At least long enough for you to die of something else. The other reason? Desperation. Imagine you're sweating through a fever, oozing from every orifice, and the doctor just bled you dry last week. If someone comes along waving a vial of elixir of life, you don't ask questions, you drink. Even if it smells like fermented goat socks and tastes worse going down than up. And if you're thinking, okay, but at least we don't do that anymore, well, welcome to the 21st century, where Gwyneth Paltrow is selling candles that smell like body parts, and someone somewhere is still drinking bleach for health. The snake oil has better branding now, but the sales pitch hasn't changed much. This mysterious substance will detoxify your organs, align your soul, and probably cure your taxes. No clinical trials, but lots of testimonials from people named Skylar on Instagram. So, yes, medieval medicine was ridiculous, but also disturbingly familiar. We've just swapped out unicorn horn for collagen powder and replaced the apothecary's grimy shelves with influencer-curated wellness kits. The labels are shinier now. The science is still catching up. And back then, if the potions didn't work, well, you still had surgery, and let me tell you, that was really where the fun began. Picture this. You, fully conscious, surrounded by men with knives and no concept of germs, a real choose-your-own-trauma adventure. But we'll get to that. Ah yes, surgery in the Middle Ages, because nothing screams cutting-edge medicine like someone sawing off your leg with a rusty blade, while you bite down on a piece of wood and scream into the void. If you've ever thought, hey, I could have survived in the past, this is the part where you realize, no, you could not. So let's talk about what passed for surgery when pain relief was a prayer, and antiseptics were still centuries away from crashing the party. Imagine needing an operation, and your choices are either A. Slowly die of whatever horrific thing is rotting inside you, or B. Let a man with zero formal training, shaking hands, and a questionable moustache cut you open in a room that smelled like sweat, pus, and despair. Fun times. First up, anesthesia, or rather the stunning lack of it. The concept of knocking someone out before slicing them open. That's modern luxury. Medieval surgeons preferred the good old-fashioned hold him down and hope he passes out technique. Occasionally, they'd offer a rag soaked in vinegar or strong wine, not to ease the pain, just to distract you from the existential dread. In some advanced cases, they used something called a dwale, which was basically a mix of hemlock, opium, and bile. Yes, actual bile. Imagine drinking something that could kill you before the scalpel even touched you. Bold strategy. And while you're contemplating that, picture this. You're in a dimly lit room, lying on a wooden board, and someone, probably a barber, is sharpening a knife that looks like it's been used more on pigs than people. He's not humming a cheery tune. He's sweating, because he knows this could go wrong in exactly 7 different ways, and he's still going to do it. You're not knocked out. You're not even mildly numbed. You're about to be wide awake for an amputation. Amputations were the medieval surgeon's go-to move. Got an infected leg, cut it off, finger full of gangrene, say goodbye. Something hurts, but we're not sure why. Let's roll the dice and remove it. Accuracy was loose. There were no X-rays, no MRIs. Just a quick glance and a firm belief that the solution to every problem was less body. And this wasn't delicate, precise work. This was get it done before the patient bleeds out or dies from shock speed surgery. They prided themselves on quickness, not cleanliness. Which brings us to infection. Sterilization wasn't a thing. Surgeons might rinse their tools in water, maybe. But more often than not, they'd go from one operation to another with the same blood-caked knife. No gloves, no hand washing, just vibes. So even if the surgery technically went well, you had a decent chance of dying later from sepsis or gangrene. If you were lucky, it was a slow, sleepy fade. If not, your body basically turned into a human compost pile. And they still thought the main problem was imbalanced humours. Now, you might be wondering, how did barbers end up performing surgery in the first place? Great question. In the 13th century, the church, ever helpful, decided that cutting into human flesh was too sinful for actual doctors, who were often monks or clergy, so the dirty work got passed on to barbers, who were already handy with razors and weren't too squeamish. That's why we have the charming term, barber surgeon. Yes, the guy who gave you a terrible bowl cut and a shave might also be your go-to for removing arrows or lancing boils. One-stop shop. They even had different outfits. Academic physicians wore long robes and spent most of their time diagnosing from a safe, book-filled distance. Barber surgeons wore aprons and got covered in things that definitely weren't shampoo, but society needed both. One gave you Latin explanations for your condition, the other physically yanked the bad parts out. In fairness, one of them was technically doing more to help. Let's not forget trepanation. That's the ancient practice of drilling a hole in someone's skull to treat head injuries, seizures, or just an excess of bad air. If your headache didn't kill you, the treatment might. They believed the brain wasn't super important, more like a cooling system for the body's heat. So sure, poke around in there. What's the worst that could happen? And then there was dentistry, loose term. More like tooth extraction with a vengeance. Cavities? No fillings. Just yank it. Infected tooth? Also yank it. Entire jaw swollen and you can't eat? You guessed it, yank it. The tools were iron, the grip was firm, and the strategy was brute force. Bonus points if the patient didn't bite you mid-yank. No painkillers, just a strong arm and maybe a drink afterward if you survived. Of course, not everyone survived. In fact, a fair few didn't. The mortality rate for surgery was high, shockingly high, and yet people still lined up for it, because the alternative was to rot in bed while your relatives whispered about sin and curses. At least surgery gave you a fighting chance, a painful, often fatal chance, but hey, it was something. Now, if you're thinking, well, at least they were trying, yes, they were. But the bar was on the floor, and even then they tripped over it. Still, we owe a strange sort of gratitude to these early butchers with their bone saws and bravado. They laid the mangled groundwork for modern surgical techniques. In between all the screaming infections and questionable sawing angles, some of them even noticed patterns like, maybe don't cut into a person with dirty tools. Revolutionary stuff. So next time you complain about the waiting time at urgent care, remember that 700 years ago, your treatment options were pray, bleed, or let a guy named Jeffrey remove your leg with a meat cleaver he just used on someone else. And no, you don't get a lollipop afterward. Just a bucket for the blood and a very distant look in your eyes. Let's say, for the sake of your optimism, that you managed to survive the leeches, the mummy powder, and the enthusiastic barber with the hacksaw. Congratulations. You've made it to the final boss of medieval medicine, the con artist. Because if your illness didn't kill you, the treatment probably would. And if that didn't work, there was always some guy in a feathered hat selling hope in a bottle and a guaranteed one-way ticket to liver failure. Let's be clear, not every doctor in the Middle Ages was a doctor. In fact, most weren't. Universities did technically exist, and yes, they handed out medical degrees that involved a lot of Latin and very little touching of actual human bodies. But out in the real world, the average healer had the medical credentials of a particularly confident potato salesman. So how could you tell who was legit and who was just a guy with a wagon, a robe, and a dream? You couldn't. You couldn't tell. That was the whole problem. Medical licensing didn't really become a thing until much later. And even then, enforcement was about as reliable as a paper umbrella in a thunderstorm. So if someone showed up at the village square claiming to be able to cure your boils with a piece of dried goat intestine soaked in wine and blessed under a full moon, people listened. Because what else were you going to do? The hospital was full of rats. The local surgeon had just amputated a guy's arm because he sneezed weird. And frankly, you were desperate. Enter the charlatans, masters of spectacle, drama and salesmanship. They were the spiritual ancestors of modern-day infomercial hosts. They travelled from town to town with wagons full of coloured bottles, strange powders, and enough self-confidence to sell you back your own kidneys. Some even staged fake miracle recoveries. An assistant would limp dramatically onto the stage, drink the potion, and then leap around like a caffeinated goat. It was medieval theatre, with blood, sometimes real. These travelling doctors often relied on flashy language, exotic ingredients, and mysterious foreign origins to impress. Because obviously, something from the East, or even better, the Far East, had to be magical. Doesn't matter if it's just crushed beetle in a jar labelled dragon saliva. It sounds convincing. And back then, that was 90% of the job. The other 10% was fleeing town before your patient started vomiting. But the thing is, not all of these people were cynical frauds. Some genuinely believed in what they were doing, which brings us to the cunning folk. Now, before you imagine a Dungeons & Dragons character with a wide-brimmed hat and a raven on their shoulder, let me clarify. Cunning folk were the local healers, herbalists, and part-time witches of medieval Europe. Often women, but not always. They blended herbal remedies, Folk magic, astrology and prayer into a chaotic stew of hope and superstition. Need a love potion? Done. A protection spell for your cows? Sure. A cure for your festering foot wound? Let's add some time and chant to Saint Apollonia. The line between healer and witch was, let's say, deliberately blurry. These people operated outside of the official medical system, which, to be fair, wasn't much more scientific. But they were deeply embedded in their communities, and people trusted them. Not because their cures always worked, but because they listened. They didn't show up, bleed you half to death, and then invoice your relatives for the burial fees. They actually stuck around. Sometimes with herbs, sometimes with spells, and occasionally with something that might have helped by accident. This blend of trust, familiarity, and just enough mystery gave them power. The church, of course, hated that. Anything that smelled even vaguely like paganism was suspicious, and more than a few cunning folk ended up on the wrong end of a witch trial because someone's cow got sick and they needed a scapegoat. Which is ironic, considering scapegoats were also used in folk magic, usually after being disemboweled and flung into a river. It was a weird time. Now let's talk about some celebrity-level charlatans. Because yes, even in the Middle Ages, people had brand loyalty. Take Theodore Turquet de Mayenne, a 17th century physician to English royalty. He wasn't quite a fraud, but he did recommend mercury as a treatment for pretty much everything. Mercury, by the way, is poison, but it was shiny, exotic, and expensive. 3 things medieval people couldn't resist, especially when it came with a promise to fix their melancholy, which may or may not have just been a bad hangover and a collapsing marriage. Then there's Paracelsus, a Swiss physician who, in the early 1500s, basically told traditional medicine to go screw itself. He burned medical textbooks in public, declared himself smarter than all previous doctors, and championed the use of chemicals in medicine. Was he wrong? Not always. Was he completely full of himself? Absolutely. Did he maybe poison a few people along the way? Almost certainly. But he also accidentally helped invent toxicology, so silver lining. The truth is, when your body is falling apart and you're fresh out of options, rational thinking goes out the window. That's true now, and it was especially true when the official medical system involved bloodletting, burning herbs, and hoping the saints were in a good mood. Desperation made people vulnerable, and vulnerability made con men very, very rich. But the people who fell for these scams weren't stupid, they were survivors. And when survival means either trusting the guy with the talking parrot and the miracle tincture, or going home to die quietly of gangrene, yeah, you're probably going to buy the tincture. So that's medieval medical fraud in a nutshell. A spectrum that ran from well-meaning herbalist to sociopathic snake oil merchant, with a heavy dose of religious paranoia and questionable hygiene sprinkled in, and all of it wrapped in the comforting lie that something could help if you just believed hard enough and had enough silver coins. Because sometimes the illusion of a cure was better than the reality of a doctor. And if none of that worked, well, at least you got a cool story before you died of infected tonsils. Ah yes, we've arrived at the grand finale of our medieval medical meltdown. And here's the big plot twist. The best medical advice back then wasn't how to get treated, but how not to get sick in the first place. Which, given everything we've discussed, kind of feels like telling someone trapped in a burning house to just avoid the flames. Because once illness set in, medieval medicine transformed into an elaborate stage play. A lot of gesturing, some blood, and absolutely no real solutions. The smarter move? Dodge the entire healthcare system like it was charging you by the leech. Let's start with the absolute medieval showstopper, the Black Death. You know it, you fear it, you've probably seen at least one poorly animated YouTube explainer on it. But to medieval Europe, It was less history documentary and more real-time apocalypse. Between 1347 and 1351, the plague killed an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population, 1 in 3. Imagine looking at your dinner table and deciding which relative just doesn't make the cut. Now, what did medieval doctors do in response? They masked up, literally, with those famous beak-nosed plague doctor outfits, which were supposed to filter out the bad air, or miasma. That's right, they believed disease floated in on invisible stink clouds, like an evil Febreze. The beaks were filled with herbs and spices to make the air smell better, as if cloves could stop Yersinia pestis from turning your lymph nodes into death balloons. Their treatments? Let's just say they ranged from questionable to please don't. Bloodletting made a comeback, because if your body is full of infected blood, why not just spill some of it out and hope for the best? They also suggested sitting close to fire, bathing in rosewater, or, and I wish this were a joke, rubbing chopped up snake on your boils. There's a certain creativity in that, sure, but creativity is not the same as efficacy. And lest we think these were isolated blips, let's zoom out. Hygiene in medieval cities was ambitious. Streets doubled as sewers. People dumped chamber pots out of windows with all the precision of a toddler throwing cereal. Rats were basically honorary citizens. The concept of wash your hands before eating wouldn't catch on until several centuries and countless infections later. Public health infrastructure, as we understand it, was more of a do-it-yourself situation. Wealthy people fled to the countryside at the first sneeze. The poor stayed put, coughed dramatically, and hoped someone nearby had snake paste or holy water. Hospitals. Yes, technically they existed. But don't get excited. Medieval hospitals weren't so much places for healing as they were spiritual pit stops. Run by religious orders, their main job was to help the sick die well, not get better. Think less clinical care and more death with prayer support. Beds were shared, tools weren't cleaned, disease control policies were, well, they lit a lot of candles. That counts, right? And to be fair, some of these hospitals genuinely tried. They separated patients by illness type, had rudimentary food service, and maintained a schedule of prayer. But sterilization was not a thing, and the idea of germs wouldn't show up until a guy named Pasteur got curious about spoiled milk in the 19th century. So, it's safe to say the medieval hospital experience was less Grey's Anatomy, more saw to with incense. Of course, there were people trying to do better. Islamic physicians in places like Baghdad and Cordoba had figured out quite a bit about hygiene and quarantine centuries earlier. They built hospitals with running water and implemented protocols that, while not modern, were at least less lethal. But Christian Europe mostly missed that memo, because why learn from someone who pronounces science with a different accent? So, what's the takeaway here? Honestly, if you time-travelled back to medieval Europe, your best bet was to avoid doctors, charlatans, and anyone with a knife and an opinion. Prevention meant staying clean, which was already a tall order, staying far away from other people, even harder, and praying to your favourite saint like your soul depended on it, because it did. And that brings us to the real MVP of medieval healthcare: luck. Genetic resistance, accidental isolation, or just sheer dumb fortune were more reliable than most treatments available at the time. Getting sick was a gamble. Getting better was divine intervention. Compare that to now, where yes, your doctor might put you on hold for 45 minutes and pronounce your name like they're playing a guessing game, but they probably won't suggest drilling a hole in your skull to fix your anxiety. Progress. Modern sanitation, vaccines, antibiotics, anesthesia, all the boring life-saving stuff didn't exist back then. But today, we flush toilets without it being a public hazard. We scrub in before surgery. And most importantly, your pharmacist isn't grinding up mummies and calling it renewed vitality. At least not legally. So next time you get annoyed about filling out a clipboard at the doctor's office or waiting 3 days for lab results, remember, you could have lived in a world where your entire medical plan was drink this wine, bleed a little and hope. We've come a long way, and honestly, thank whatever deity, germ theory or vaccinated immune system got you here in one piece. Now go wash your hands, just in case. Thanks for sticking around to the end. I appreciate you spending your time diving into the gloriously unhinged world of medieval medicine with me. If nothing else, I hope this helped you feel a little more grateful for antibiotics, anesthesia, and the fact that your doctor doesn't carry a jar of leeches to your annual checkup. If you enjoyed this and you're weirdly into historical horror stories wrapped in sarcasm, go ahead and hit that like button. It lets the algorithm know I'm not just yelling into the void. And if you want more of this kind of smart, slightly cynical storytelling, feel free to subscribe. I've got more coming, and it only gets weirder from here. Let me know in the comments what part of medieval medicine made you the most uncomfortable, or which century you'd least want to be sick in. I read them all, even the ones written at 3 a.m. by sleep-deprived insomniacs, especially those. Alright, that's it for now. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and for the love of all that's hygienic, avoid the leeches. Thanks for watching.